Hey there, viewers. Before we dive into this jaw-dropping story, I'm curious. Where are you watching from? And what time is it for you right now? It's always fascinating to see how far our community reaches. Now, get ready, because we're about to hear the shocking details a lawyer just revealed about Diddy. Chapter 1. The Case. What could possibly compel someone like me to work with a man like him? Let me tell you, it wasn't what I expected. It all started with a phone call late on a Friday afternoon. I had just wrapped up a deposition in a messy corporate fraud case when my assistant popped her head into my office. "You might want to take this one," she said, her voice carrying a mix of urgency and curiosity. On the other end of the line was someone claiming to represent Sean Diddy Combs, a name. The voice was smooth, almost rehearsed, as the caller explained that they were reaching out to me because of my reputation for taking on the toughest cases. They didn't waste time on pleasantries, diving straight into why they needed me. According to them, Diddy was facing what they called a coordinated smear campaign. They painted a picture of a man under attack from opportunists and a media eager to sensationalize his life. "We're looking for someone who can handle the pressure," they said, "someone who can cut through the noise and get to the truth." I leaned back in my chair, listening but not fully buying the pitch. My reputation wasn't built on flattery. I had earned it through years of navigating high-stakes cases with a steady hand and a clear moral compass. But this felt different. It wasn't just the scale of the allegations against Diddy. It was the weight of the name itself. This wasn't some faceless corporation or anonymous defendant. This was a man whose influence extended far beyond the courtroom. Still, I couldn't ignore the elephant in the room. The allegations against Diddy weren't whispers, they were shouted from headlines. Sexual assault, trafficking, racketeering. The accusations painted a picture far more damning than the smear campaign his representative described. It wasn't a matter of whether I'd heard about them. It was whether I could stomach the idea of standing in his corner. "I'm aware of the case," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "But let's not pretend this is just about public relations. The allegations are serious." The voice on the other end hesitated for a moment, then pivoted. "We understand your reservations. That's exactly why we need someone like you. Mr. Combs believes in his innocence and wants the best to represent him. He's ready to meet with you directly to explain his side." That's when the intrigue set in. I had built my career on dissecting the gray areas of the law, on separating fact from fiction when emotions ran high. Part of me was repulsed by the idea of taking the case, but another part, perhaps the more dangerous part, was curious. What would it be like to sit across from a man like Diddy and hear his version of events? Was there something I could uncover that the rest of the world hadn't? I glanced at the file they'd sent over while we were speaking, a preliminary overview of the lawsuits, neatly summarized as if packaging the accusations could make them less horrifying. It was a slick move, but it didn't fool me. The lawyer in me was already calculating the angles, weighing the risks and rewards. The human in me, however, was grappling with something far less clinical. The nagging question of whether this was a line I wanted to cross. I didn't give an answer right away. Instead, I ended the call with a promise to consider the offer. Over the weekend, I pored over the details. The accusations weren't just damning, they were intricate, pointing to a pattern of behavior that stretched back years. There were NDAs, settlements, and whispers of things that never made it to court. But there were also gaps, places where the evidence felt thin, where the accusations seemed to rely more on hearsay than hard proof. Those gaps were what intrigued me the most. They felt like spaces where a skilled lawyer could work some magic or uncover something much darker. By Sunday evening, my decision was made. I wasn't committing to the case. Not yet. But I was committing to a meeting. If nothing else, I wanted to see for myself whether Diddy was the mastermind his accusers described, or just another man drowning in the weight of his empire. As I dialed the number to confirm the meeting, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stepping onto a tightrope with no safety net. "I'll meet him," I said when the voice picked up on the other end. "But this is strictly fact-finding, no promises." "Of course," they replied smoothly, as if they'd expected nothing less. "Mr. Combs will be ready for you." I hung up the phone, staring at the case file on my desk. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just another case. This was something else entirely. Chapter 2. First Impressions of Diddy. I knew I was walking into the lion's den. What I didn't know was how sharp those teeth really were. The first thing that struck me about Diddy's estate wasn't the size, although it was sprawling, or the luxury, which seemed almost garish. It was the silence. For a man whose public image was tied to music, parties, and an entourage that rivaled a small army, the quiet was unsettling. The long driveway wound through manicured hedges and perfectly trimmed lawns. But there wasn't a single person in sight. No security guards patrolling, no staff scurrying about. Just silence. I was greeted at the door by a sharply dressed assistant who introduced herself as Miss Robbins and escorted me inside. The house was a masterpiece of modern architecture. Clean lines, glass walls, and marble floors that echoed with every step we took. It was the kind of place designed to impress, to remind you who held the power in the room before you even met them. As we moved through the house, I noticed details that didn't quite fit. A vase placed just slightly off-center on a pristine table, a faint scuff mark on the edge of an otherwise spotless floor. It was almost as if the perfection was a facade, a polished exterior hiding cracks just below the surface. "Mr. Combs will see you now," Robin said, breaking my thoughts as she opened the door to what I assumed was his study. Diddy stood as I entered, extending a hand with a smile that could disarm even the most cynical skeptic. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice smooth, his tone measured. He was dressed casually in a way that was clearly intentional. Designer sweatpants, a crisp white t-shirt, and a watch that probably cost more than my car. Everything about him radiated control, from his posture to the way he gestured toward the chair across from him. "Mr. Combs," I said, shaking his hand. His grip was firm, but not overly so. A calculated move, I was sure. "Thank you for inviting me." "Please, call me Sean," he replied, flashing another smile as he motioned for me to sit. "I appreciate you taking the time. I know my situation is complicated." Complicated was an understatement, but I kept my expression neutral. "I've reviewed the basics," I said. "I'd like to hear your perspective before making any decisions." He nodded, leaning back in his chair with the ease of a man who is used to controlling conversations. "Of course. I understand you probably have your doubts. The media loves to twist things, and people love a good scandal, especially when it's about someone like me. But let me tell you, most of this is nothing more than a coordinated attack. People trying to take me down for their own gain. Fighting all those persecutions? People trying to take me down for their own gain?" He spoke with the kind of charisma that made you want to believe him. He didn't just tell his story, he performed it, his voice rising and falling in perfect rhythm. He painted himself as the victim of an industry conspiracy, a man who had become a target simply because of his success. "They'll do whatever it takes to tear me down." As he spoke, I couldn't help but notice how carefully he chose his words. He glossed over the more serious accusations, focusing instead on what he called character assassinations and unfair portrayals. It was a clever tactic, designed to make me question the validity of the claims without outright denying them. But there was something else, something beneath the surface that didn't sit right with me. I decided to push just a little. "You've mentioned the media's role in this, but what about the specific allegations? These are serious claims and they come from multiple parties. How do you respond to that?" For the first time, his smile faltered. It was brief, barely a flicker, but it was there. His tone shifted as he replied, a slight edge creeping into his voice. "Of course, they're serious. That's the whole point. Make the accusations big enough and people will believe them, whether they're true or not. These are people with their own agendas, trying to make a name for themselves at my expense." He leaned forward, his gaze intense. You've seen how these things work, haven't you? You've defended people in situations like this before. You know the truth doesn't matter as much as the narrative. It was a calculated move, flipping the question back on me, forcing me to empathize with him, and for a moment it almost worked. But then I saw it. A flash of something in his eyes, a mix of frustration and control. It wasn't the look of a man who felt wronged. It was the look of a man who was used to getting his way. The conversation continued, with Diddy alternating between charm and subtle aggression. He painted himself as a man under siege, fighting for his reputation against forces that wanted to destroy him. But the more he talked, the more I sensed the manipulation behind his words. It wasn't just about convincing me of his innocence. It was about pulling. As the meeting drew to a close, Diddy leaned back, his demeanor shifting once again to the polished, confident man who had greeted me. "I'll be honest with you," he said. "I don't just need a lawyer. I need someone who can see the bigger picture, someone who knows how to win." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a checkbook, scribbling a number that made my stomach drop. "This is just the retainer," he said, sliding the check across the desk. "You'll find the rest more than generous." I stared at the check for a moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. This wasn't just about money or even the case itself. It was about what taking this case would mean. For my career, for my integrity, for everything I stood for. I left the meeting with the check in my briefcase and a knot in my stomach. I wasn't sure if I was stepping into an opportunity or a trap, but one thing was certain. This wasn't the last time Sean Combs would surprise me. Chapter 3, The Case Files. At first, it looked like any other case, but there was something they didn't want me to find. The files arrived 3 days after my meeting with Diddy, delivered in an unmarked black case that screamed confidential. 2 members of his legal team personally handed it off to my assistant, their grim expressions making it clear that discretion was non-negotiable. I didn't need the reminder. This wasn't my first high-profile case, but the tension surrounding this one felt different. Heavier, darker. As I opened the case in my office that evening, I was greeted by a mountain of documents. Stacks of depositions, witness testimonies, financial records, and press clippings were neatly organized into color-coded folders. At first glance, the sheer volumes seemed impressive, as if to imply that Diddy's team had nothing to hide. But as I began to sift through the material, it became clear that the organization was a facade. The deeper I dug, the more inconsistencies I found. The depositions were a mix of chillingly detailed accounts and vague denials. Several accusers described eerily similar patterns of coercion, invitations to exclusive parties where they were made to feel special, followed by a rapid descent into control and fear. One testimony stood out, a woman who claimed she had been drugged at one of Diddy's infamous events. Her description of waking up in a room she didn't recognize, surrounded by strangers who avoided eye contact, was haunting. But then, just as her account reached its peak, the deposition abruptly ended, with a note indicating the rest of her statement had been sealed by a prior settlement. It felt like a story with the ending ripped out. The financial records painted an equally troubling picture. Payments to individuals listed as consultants and event organizers raised immediate red flags. The amounts were significant, but the descriptions were vague, and the timing often coincided with the dates of alleged incidents. It was clear that money wasn't just a tool for damage control. It was part of the machinery. There were even records of NDAs tied to payouts, some of which included clauses that extended beyond the usual terms of confidentiality. One clause explicitly prohibited recipients from disparaging or implicating associated parties directly or indirectly for a period of no less than 15 years. What stood out most were the depositions from former employees. Security personnel, personal assistants, and even drivers described a culture of fear and control. One account from a former bodyguard detailed how staff were instructed to confiscate phones at parties, and how guests were pressured to sign NDAs upon arrival. "We weren't there to protect him," the bodyguard wrote. "We were there to protect his secrets." The more I read, the more uneasy I felt. Patterns began to emerge, patterns of coercion, financial manipulation, and systemic abuse. There was a precision to it all, as if every move had been calculated, every loose end tied up just enough to avoid unraveling. And yet, there were cracks. Small inconsistencies in Diddy's statements compared to the evidence began to pile up. For example, he had claimed that certain accusers were never present at his events, yet there were time-stamped photos in the files showing them in the background. In another instance, a woman who had supposedly been paid off to drop her allegations appeared in an unrelated email chain months later, seeking legal advice about a non-disclosure violation. It wasn't just the evidence itself that was troubling, it was the way Diddy's team presented it. The files came with a media strategy section, outlining how to spin certain details in court and in the public eye. The language was cold, almost clinical, with phrases like minimize emotional impact and redirect narrative focus to external motives. It felt less like a legal defense and more like a playbook for manipulation. The PR team's tactics extended to me as well. In a follow-up call, one of Diddy's senior advisors casually suggested that I frame certain testimonies as attention-seeking behavior and push the narrative that these women were simply out for money. It's not just about the facts, he said. It's about controlling the story. The implication was clear. My role wasn't just to defend Diddy in court, but to protect the empire he had built. It was a test of loyalty, one that I was already failing in my mind. Then came the moment that changed everything. Buried in the middle of a folder labeled miscellaneous, I found a sealed envelope, its surface marked with the initials of one of Diddy's key accusers. It wasn't just out of place, it was intentionally hidden, tucked between unrelated financial statements, as if someone had hoped it would go unnoticed. My curiosity outweighed. Inside was a collection of documents that made my stomach drop. There were handwritten notes detailing arrangements for events, complete with names, dates, and locations. A few were accompanied by photos, grainy but unmistakable, showing young women in vulnerable positions, their faces a mix of confusion and fear. One note referenced a woman whose name I recognized from the allegations. The chilling part was the date. It predated the public accusations by nearly 2 years. The final item in the envelope was a typed memo, unsigned but clearly written by someone in Diddy's inner circle. It outlined a strategy for dealing with potential whistleblowers, listing tactics like offer settlements, isolate socially, and, most disturbingly, monitor for vulnerabilities. It was the kind of document you'd expect to find in a crime thriller, not a legal case. I sat back, staring at the pile of evidence on my desk. This wasn't just about defending a man accused of heinous acts. This was about a system, one built on fear, control, and the calculated destruction of anyone who dared to step out of line. And I was being asked to become a part of it. For the first time in my career, I wasn't sure if I could separate the client from the crime. The lines between professional and personal morality had always been blurry, but now they felt non-existent. This wasn't just another case. This was a decision that would define who I was, not just as a lawyer, but as a person. The sealed envelope sat on the edge of my desk as I closed the file for the night. I couldn't bring myself to put it back in the case with the rest of the documents. It felt like a symbol of everything I was about to walk into, and everything I might not be able to walk away from. Chapter 4. A disturbing discovery. What I found in that envelope shook me to my core. This wasn't just a case. It was a cover-up. I sat in my office long after midnight, the envelope and its contents spread out before me like pieces of a sinister puzzle. The initial shock of finding it had faded, replaced by a cold determination to understand what I was looking at. The documents were a chaotic mix of handwritten notes, cryptic spreadsheets, and grainy photographs, each more unsettling than the last. It was clear that whoever put this together wasn't expecting anyone to find it or understand it if they did, but they hadn't counted on me. The first document was a coded spreadsheet, its columns labeled with cryptic abbreviations. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary financial ledger, but as I compared the entries with dates from the case files, a pattern began to emerge. The transactions, many of them disguised as payments for consulting or event management, aligned with the timelines of several allegations. There were even annotations, short, chilling notes like handled, settled, and, in one instance, neutralized. My legal mind struggled to process the implications. This wasn't just about silencing victims. It was about systematically erasing their voices, ensuring they never had the chance to come forward. Then there were the photographs. Grainy and low resolution, they captured moments that felt stolen, invasive. Some were of young women at what appeared to be parties, champagne flutes in hand, expressions teetering between joy and discomfort. Others were darker, showing blurred faces in dimly lit rooms. One photo in particular made my stomach turn. A woman sitting on a couch, her body language screaming discomfort as a hand rested too close to her shoulder. The timestamp on the photo was dated nearly 3 years before the first public allegation against Diddy. Among the documents was something that felt like the linchpin of the entire operation, a non-disclosure agreement. Unlike the others I had seen, this one wasn't tied to a settlement or any public legal proceedings. It referenced a victim whose name I didn't recognize, suggesting she hadn't yet come forward. The language was chillingly specific, detailing restrictions that went beyond the usual scope of NDAs. It prohibited the individual not just from speaking about the events in question, but also from engaging with parties who may incite discourse harmful to associated interests. In simpler terms, don't talk, don't even think about talking, and don't let anyone else talk for you. The date on the NDA caught my attention immediately. It predated the public allegations by over a year. If this document was real, it meant the abuse wasn't just ongoing, it was premeditated, planned down to the finest detail. The victim wasn't just silenced, she was preemptively erased from the narrative. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the mess of evidence on my desk. This wasn't just a case against Diddy. This was a meticulously constructed machine designed to protect him and the people who benefited from his power. The more I pieced together, the more I realized this wasn't about one man. This was a web of secrecy and complicity, implicating people far beyond the scope of the lawsuits. As the weight of what I was uncovering settled on me, so did a growing sense of dread. This wasn't just a legal problem, it was a moral one. I couldn't unsee what I had found, but I also couldn't ignore the risks of acting on it. Diddy's influence wasn't confined to the music industry or the courtroom. It reached into places I couldn't begin to comprehend. People who crossed him didn't just lose cases. They lost careers, reputations, and sometimes more. I thought back to my meeting with Diddy, replaying his words in my mind. The charm, the calculated vulnerability, the thinly veiled threats. He wasn't just a client trying to clear his name, he was the architect of a system designed to keep him untouchable. And now, by accepting this case, I had stepped into that system. I was no longer an outsider looking in. I was part of it. The thought made my skin crawl. I had always prided myself on my ability to stay objective, to separate the client from the crime. But this wasn't about objectivity anymore. It was about complicity. Every moment I stayed on this case, I was lending credibility to a man who had built an empire on the backs of silenced victims. And yet, walking away wasn't as simple as tearing up a contract. Not with what I had seen, not with what I knew. The next morning, I arrived at my office to find an email from Diddy's legal team. The subject line was innocuous enough, case strategy update. But as I opened it, I felt a chill run down my spine. The email contained a draft statement for me to deliver publicly, outlining Diddy's defense and discrediting the allegations against him. It was written in my voice, as if I had already agreed to take the case. At worst, it referenced details from the sealed envelope, details I hadn't shared with anyone. It was a warning as much as it was a test. They knew what I had found. They wanted to see how far I was willing to go to protect their client, and they wanted me to know that they were watching. Later that day, I received a call from Diddy himself. His tone was casual, almost cheerful, as if we were old friends catching up. "I trust you've seen everything you need," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "I like to make sure my team has all the tools they need to succeed." There it was, an admission without admitting anything. He knew what I had uncovered, and he was daring me to do something about it. It wasn't a threat, not directly. It was worse than that. It was a reminder of who held the power in this arrangement. I ended the call with a polite but non-committal response, my mind racing. The evidence in that envelope wasn't just damning, it was dangerous. If I walked away from this case, there was no guarantee I'd be safe from the fallout. And if I stayed, I wasn't sure I could live with myself. That night, I locked the envelope and its contents in my office safe, the weight of it pressing down on me like a physical burden. For the first time in my career, I felt trapped, caught between the person I wanted to be and the reality of the world I had stepped into. This wasn't just about Diddy's crimes, it was about a system that allowed them to happen, and the people who helped keep it hidden. Chapter 5. A Meeting of Warning. He didn't need me to clear his name, he needed me to protect what was left of his empire, and that was something I couldn't be part of. By the time I walked into Diddy's estate for our next meeting, the weight of the sealed envelope and everything it revealed was like a stone in my chest. The place looked the same as before, pristine, opulent, and unsettlingly quiet. But this time, the atmosphere felt heavier. It wasn't just the silence that unnerved me, it was the knowledge of what I had uncovered. Diddy greeted me in the same study, his demeanor as relaxed as ever. He wore a tailored hoodie and sweatpants, the kind of outfit that screamed casual wealth. "Good to see you again," he said, flashing that disarming smile. "I hope you've been taking your time with the files. It's a lot to digest, I know." He motioned for me to sit, and I obliged, masking my unease with a practiced poker face. I had spent the last 2 days preparing for this conversation, rehearsing every question, every possible response. I needed answers, but I couldn't afford to tip my hand. Not yet. "Have been," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "And you're right, it's a lot. The scope of the allegations, the media attention. It's not a simple case." Diddy leaned back in his chair, his expression almost amused. "It's never simple when you're at the top," he said. "People always want a piece of you. They don't care how hard you worked to get here. They just see an opportunity." His words were smooth, calculated, the same narrative he had spun during our first meeting, but this time I wasn't here to be convinced. "Some of the evidence is concerning," I said carefully. "There are patterns that raise questions, especially regarding the financial records and the NDAs." For a moment, his expression didn't change. Then, slowly, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Questions?" he echoed, his voice dropping just enough to send a chill down my spine. "Like what?" I chose my words deliberately, avoiding anything that might reveal how much I knew. There's a lot of material to go through, and some of it feels incomplete. If I'm going to build a strong defense, I need to understand the full picture. Diddy's eyes narrowed slightly, the faintest crack in his polished facade. "The full picture," he repeated, almost to himself. Then he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You're thorough, I like that. But let me save you some time. This isn't about evidence or facts, it's about perception. People don't care about the truth, they care about the soul." The shift in his tone was subtle but unmistakable. Gone was the charm, replaced by something colder, more calculating. "You've been in this business long enough to know how it works," he continued. "Everyone plays the game. The only difference is, I play it better." I felt my pulse quicken, but I forced myself to stay calm. "What do you mean by the game?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. Diddy chuckled, a low, almost dismissive sound. Come on, you think I got here by playing nice? This industry isn't for the weak. You take what you want and you make sure no one can take it from you. That's how it works. There was a weight to his words, an unspoken implication that hung in the air like a storm cloud. And what happens to the people who cross you? I asked, pushing just enough to see how he would react. His smile returned, but this time it was razor sharp. Let's just say they learn their lesson, he said. You think these lawsuits are the first time someone's tried to come after me? Please, people talk big until they realize what they're up against. And then, well, he trailed off, letting the silence fill in the blanks. The room felt colder, the air heavier. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. There was no bravado, no need to exaggerate. He spoke like a man who knew the weight of his words, who didn't need to spell out the consequences because they were already understood. I thought of the documents in the sealed envelope, the names and faces that had been reduced to lines on a spreadsheet. This wasn't about defending an innocent man. This was about protecting a system, a machine designed to crush anyone who stood in its way. You don't need to worry about the details, Diddy said, breaking the silence. That's what my team is for. All I need from you is loyalty. The rest, we'll handle it. Loyalty. The word felt like a trap, a line drawn in the sand. This wasn't a defense strategy, it was an ultimatum. He wasn't asking me to represent him, he was asking me to become part of his empire, to shield him from the consequences of his actions and ensure the machine kept running. I realized then that I couldn't do it. Whatever justifications I had made to myself, the challenge, the opportunity, the money, they all crumbled under the weight of what I now knew. This wasn't just a case, it was a choice, and the cost of saying yes was too high. But walking away wasn't simple either. Not with what I had uncovered. Not with the way Diddy spoke, as if he already knew every move I might make, as if he had already prepared for it. I'll need some time to review everything, I said finally, standing to leave. There's a lot to consider. Diddy stood as well, his smile returning to its practiced charm. Take all the time you need, he said. Just remember, this isn't just about me. It's about all of us. His words followed me out of the study, echoing in my mind as I walked back to my car. By the time I reached the driveway, I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't stay on this case. But leaving wouldn't be as simple as handing in my resignation. Diddy didn't just want a lawyer. He wanted a shield, a pawn in a game I didn't want to play. And now that I had seen behind the curtain, I wasn't sure if I could ever walk away without consequences. Chapter 6. Pressure and Paranoia. Walking away wasn't going to be easy. But staying, that wasn't an option anymore. The first sign that I was being watched came late one night, just 2 days after my last meeting with Diddy. I had been working in my office, going over yet another stack of files when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. Normally, I would have ignored it, but something about the timing made me pause. Hello, I answered, expecting a robocall or a wrong number. The voice on the other end was distorted, deliberately altered. Careful where you dig, it said before hanging up. I sat there for a moment, staring at the phone in my hand, trying to process what had just happened. It could have been a prank, or at least that's what I told myself. But deep down, I knew better. The timing was too perfect, the message too deliberate. Things escalated quickly after that. The next morning, my assistant handed me a plain, unmarked envelope that had been delivered to the office. Inside was a USB drive with no label or note. Against my better judgment, I plugged it into my laptop. The only file on the drive was an audio recording. It was my voice. Specifically, it was a recording of my conversation with Diddy during our last meeting. Every word, every pause, every subtle shift in tone was there, captured with crystal clarity. Someone had been listening. I shut the laptop and locked the USB drive in my desk drawer, my heart pounding in my chest. The implications were clear. I wasn't just being watched, I was being monitored. Every word I said, every move I made was under scrutiny. The paranoia set in almost immediately. I began noticing little things I hadn't paid attention to before. A car parked across the street from my house for hours at a time. Emails that seemed slightly off. The faint feeling of being followed whenever I left my office. It was subtle, just enough to make me question myself, but not enough to prove anything. Diddy's legal team wasn't helping either. They had started pushing harder, sending me draft statements and press releases they wanted me to deliver publicly. The language was aggressive, designed to discredit the accusers and paint Diddy as the victim of a smear campaign. "We need you to take control of the narrative," one of his advisors told me during a call. I stalled, claiming I needed more time to review the case, but their patience was wearing thin. "You're either with us or against us," the advisor said, his tone sharp. It was clear they were testing my loyalty, waiting to see if I would fall in line. The pressure was relentless. I began second-guessing every decision, every interaction. Even my assistant started looking at me differently, as if she could sense the weight I was carrying. I couldn't talk to anyone about what was happening, not without risking their safety as well as my own. But I wasn't completely powerless. Over the next few days, I started quietly collecting evidence. Copies of the sealed documents, emails, and even the USB drive. I didn't know what I was going to do with it, but I knew I needed to protect myself. If Diddy's team was willing to monitor me this closely, there was no telling what they might do if I tried to walk away. One night, I received another phone call, this time from someone claiming to be a journalist. They asked pointed questions about the case, referencing details that hadn't been made public. It felt like a trap, a test to see if I would leak anything. I hung up without answering, but the call left me shaken. By now, the paranoia was consuming me. I started checking my office for hidden cameras, my car for tracking devices. Every time my phone buzzed, I felt a surge of anxiety, wondering what message or threat would come next. I was living in a constant state of fear, unable to trust anyone or anything. The final straw came in the form of another package, delivered directly to my home. Inside was a single piece of paper with a photograph of my family stapled to it. The message was simple: think carefully about your next move. I stared at the photo for what felt like an eternity, my hands trembling. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. It was a warning, a reminder that Diddy's reach extended far beyond the courtroom. That night I made my decision. I couldn't stay on the case, not with the weight of what I knew, not with the risks involved. But walking away wouldn't be simple. I needed to plan my exit carefully to ensure I didn't leave myself vulnerable to retaliation. I spent hours drafting my resignation letter, each word chosen with painstaking care. I framed it as a professional decision, citing irreconcilable differences without going into specifics. I knew it wouldn't satisfy Diddy or his team, but it was the best I could do under the circumstances. As I sat at my desk, staring at the letter, I felt a mix of relief and dread. Relief that I was finally taking a step toward reclaiming my life, dread that this step might be my last. Walking away wasn't going to be easy, but staying? That wasn't an option anymore. Chapter 7. The final straw. The deeper I dug, the darker it got, but what I found next was personal, and it left me no choice but to run. I had thought I'd seen the worst of it, the sealed envelope, the veiled threats, the mounting paranoia. They had all painted a grim picture, one that I could barely stomach. But what came next wasn't just damning, it was devastating. It started when I decided to go through the case files one last time. I wasn't looking for anything specific, I just had a nagging feeling that I had missed something. The sheer volume of documents made it easy to overlook details, and I knew better than to assume everything had been laid out neatly. Diddy's team had been careful, almost too careful, which only made me more suspicious. If, I had the time to go back and look at the files. I might be able to answer him. As I flipped through the files, I noticed a folder that seemed oddly out of place. It was tucked between financial records and deposition transcripts, marked with a generic label, Miscellaneous Archive 2. At first glance, it looked unremarkable, almost like it had been thrown in as an afterthought. But when I opened it, I realized it wasn't just an archive. It was a Pandora's box. The first thing that caught my eye was a series of USB drives, each labeled with a date and a set of initials. I plugged one into my laptop, my heart pounding in anticipation. What played on the screen left me cold. It was a video, time-stamped and disturbingly explicit. The footage showed a young woman, visibly disoriented, in what appeared to be a private room. She was one of the names I had seen in the sealed envelope. The video wasn't just an invasion of privacy. It was evidence of abuse, recorded and cataloged like some grotesque trope. I watched for only a few seconds before stopping the video, unable to stomach any more. But I couldn't stop there. I needed to know how deep this went, how many more lives had been destroyed and documented for Diddy's own twisted purposes. One by one, I checked the other USB drives. Each contained similar footage, all time-stamped, all labeled with initials that matched names in the case files. The pattern was undeniable. This wasn't just evidence, it was blackmail, meticulously organized and stored as leverage against anyone who might speak out. And then I found it. One of the videos was labeled with my own initials. My blood ran cold as I stared at the screen, the implications crashing down on me like a tidal wave. I hadn't even been on the case for a month, yet they already had something prepared. I debated whether to open it, fearing what I might see, but my curiosity won out, driven by a desperate need to know how far they had gone. The video wasn't explicit like the others, but it was damning in its own way. It was a recording of me in my office, taken through what appeared to be a hidden camera. I was reviewing case files, speaking on the phone with a colleague about my doubts regarding the case. The audio was clear, every word perfectly audible. "This doesn't add up," I had said in the recording. "There's something deeper here, something they don't want me to see." I felt a wave of nausea as I realized what this meant. They weren't just watching me, they were preparing to use me as their next pawn. If I turned against them, they would twist this video, frame me as a disloyal lawyer conspiring against his own client. It was a preemptive strike, a way to ensure my silence before I even had the chance to act. I pushed the laptop away and leaned back in my chair, my mind racing. Every instinct screamed at me to burn the files, to walk away and never look back. But I couldn't. Not yet. I spent the next few hours combing through the rest of the folder, desperate to find anything that might explain why they had gone to such lengths. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about Diddy. There were names, prominent figures in the entertainment industry, politicians, even lawyers, scattered throughout the files. Some were listed as associates, others as assets, and a few as liabilities. One document in particular stood out. It was a memo, unsigned but clearly written by someone high up in Diddy's inner circle. The language was cold and clinical, detailing a strategy for neutralizing threats. It listed steps like monitor communications, isolate from allies, and, chillingly, preemptive discrediting. I realized then that I wasn't just dealing with one man's crimes. This was a network, a system built to protect the powerful and destroy anyone who threatened their empire, and I had walked right into the middle of it. By the time I closed the files, the sun was beginning to rise. I hadn't slept, but I knew I wouldn't be able to even if I tried. The weight of what I had seen was crushing, suffocating, but the worst part was knowing that I couldn't simply walk away, not without a plan. I pulled out a blank sheet of paper and began drafting my resignation letter. Every word felt like a gamble, a delicate balance between honesty and self-preservation. I cited ethical conflicts and irreconcilable differences as my reasons for stepping away, careful not to include anything that could be used against me later. But even as I wrote, I knew the letter wouldn't be enough. Diddy's team wouldn't let me go quietly, not with what I had seen. I needed a strategy, a way to protect myself in case they came after me. I picked up my phone and dialed the only person I trusted, a close confidant who had been my mentor during my early years as a lawyer. When he answered, I wasted no time. "I need your help," I said, my voice shaking. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone immediately concerned. "I can't explain over the phone," I replied, "but I'm in over my head and I don't know how to get out." We agreed to meet later that day, somewhere neutral where we wouldn't be overheard. As I hung up the phone, I felt a small flicker of relief. For the first time in days, I wasn't alone. But the relief was short-lived. As I gathered the files and prepared to lock them away, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Be careful who you trust," it read. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. They knew. They always knew. Chapter 8. The Escape. I thought walking away would bring me peace, but with someone like Diddy, the story never really ends. The day I delivered my resignation was colder than usual, though it may have been the weight on my shoulders making the air feel heavier. The words in my letter were calculated, each one chosen to convey my departure as cleanly and professionally as possible. Irreconcilable ethical differences. It was a simple phrase, but one that carried layers of meaning. I emailed the letter to Diddy's legal team first thing in the morning, fully aware of the storm it would unleash. Within minutes, my phone began ringing. At first, it was his advisors, polished voices demanding clarification, thinly veiling their irritation behind measured tones. When I didn't give them the answers they wanted, the calls became more direct. By noon, Diddy himself was on the line. "What the hell is this?" he barked, his voice sharp and aggressive, a far cry from the charming persona he had displayed in our meetings. "You think you can just walk away, after everything we've been through?" I held my ground, keeping my tone as neutral as I could. "This isn't personal, Mr. Combs. I simply can't continue on this case." "Don't give me that lawyer speak," he snapped. "You signed a contract. You're obligated to see this through." I could hear the anger bubbling beneath his words, but there was something else. Fear. He wasn't just angry that I was leaving. He was afraid of what I might do with what I knew. "I'm prepared to honor the confidentiality clauses in our agreement," I replied calmly, "but this is my final decision." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then his tone shifted. It was colder, more deliberate. "You know what happens to people who cross me," he said. "Think carefully about your next move." The line went dead before I could respond. I sat back in my chair, my hands trembling. The call had been brief, but the message was clear. Walking away wouldn't be easy. Diddy didn't just want loyalty, he demanded it, and anyone who denied him that paid the price. Later that day, I met with the one person I trusted, an old mentor who had seen more than his fair share of legal battles. I laid everything out for him, from the sealed envelope to the blackmail video to the veiled threats. He listened carefully, his expression growing darker with every detail. "You need to be very careful," he said when I finished. "People like him don't just let things go. If you push too hard, you could find yourself in real danger." "What should I do?" I asked, the desperation clear in my voice. He thought for a moment before answering. "Stay quiet for now. Keep your head down. If you feel like your safety is at risk, go to the authorities, but don't go public until you're absolutely certain you have enough to protect yourself." It wasn't the advice I had wanted to hear, but it was the advice I needed. I left the meeting with a clearer understanding of the stakes, though the weight of the decision still pressed heavily on me. Over the next few days, I began to distance myself from the case. I returned the files, deleted any emails related to Diddy, and even replaced my phone, fearing it had been compromised. But the paranoia lingered. Every time I left my house, I felt eyes on me, Cars that hadn't seemed suspicious before now felt like they were following me. One evening, as I was leaving my office, I noticed a man standing across the street watching me. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, his silhouette outlined by the dim streetlights. When I approached my car, I found a note tucked under the windshield wiper. It was simple, just a single sentence scrawled in bold, messy handwriting. "You're making this harder than it has to be." That night, I decided to take the final step. I reached out to a journalist I knew, someone with a reputation for exposing corruption and holding powerful people accountable. I didn't reveal everything, just enough to gauge their interest and test their discretion. "You're sitting on a bombshell," the journalist said after I explained the basics. "But you need to be careful. If you come forward without protection, they'll destroy you. Take your time, build your case, and when you're ready, I'll help you get the story out." The conversation gave me a small sense of relief, a glimmer of hope that I wasn't completely alone in this, but it also underscored the danger I was in. Diddy's reach was vast, his resources seemingly endless. If I made the wrong move, I could lose everything. In the days that followed, the surveillance became more blatant. My home phone rang at odd hours, only to be met with silence on the other end. Packages arrived with no return address, containing nothing but blank sheets of paper. Even my assistant reported seeing unfamiliar faces lingering around the office. I knew I couldn't live like this forever. I began quietly planning my next steps, documenting everything I could while keeping a low profile. I started carrying a small encrypted flash drive with copies of the most damning evidence, just in case I needed to flee at a moment's notice. But even as I prepared for the worst, I couldn't shake the sense of guilt that hung over me. I had come so close to becoming part of the very system I now wanted to expose. By agreeing to take the case, I had almost given legitimacy to a man whose crimes were as cold and calculated as they were horrifying. One night, as I sat alone in my office, I opened the sealed envelope one last time. I didn't know why. Maybe to remind myself why I was doing this, or maybe to confront the reality of what I had uncovered. As I stared at the names and faces, the coded transactions and hidden memos, I felt a surge of anger. This wasn't just about Diddy. This was about every person who had been silenced, every life that had been destroyed for the sake of his empire. And while I couldn't undo what had been done, I could at least ensure that the truth came out. Walking away hadn't brought me peace. It had brought me clarity. And one day, when the time was right, I would speak out. Because with someone like Diddy, the story never really ends.